start focusing my attention on the water. The water, of course, is going to have its own color, but it's also got to be a little bit transparent, as water normally would be. And I want to start figuring out and exploring what those transparency effects could look like inside of my three-dimensional scene. I want that information to go back into Blender from what I establish here in Substance Painter. So in order for us to get transparent effects, to vary the opacity of our materials, we need to change the shader that's been applied to this specific texture set. Now right now I'm on the water texture set. It's important to point out that you can do this exact same thing for individual texture sets. It's not a project-wide change, it's a texture set change. So I got my water texture set selected, and then over here in the far right hand side there's this little shader ball. These are shader settings right there. It's beneath the icon that looks like a computer monitor. And this option right here, mine says PBR Metal Rough. This is where we get to choose all the different shaders that come with Substance Painter that are available to us. And there's one called PBR Metal Rough with Alpha Blending. And this is going to allow us to change the opacity of certain components of our three-dimensional scene. So I've just loaded that shader in. On the surface, nothing should look too different. Let's change our shader settings and return to our texture set settings, which is this tab right here. There's a couple things that we need to do in here. Now, we've been spending a lot of time in the mesh maps section of our texture set settings, but if we go kind of towards the middle of it, there's a category of options here called channels. And if you click on the plus sign, we have some channels in here that we get to add. Specifically, the opacity. Mine was already out because I did it a second ago. But the opacity channel is now available to us since we changed our shader. So if we click on opacity, it now becomes a member of this texture set, and we can access and leverage this information inside of our properties. So I'm going to go into, I just have a fill layer here selected. And with my fill layer selected, if you look downstairs, check it out. We now have an option to enable or disable the opacity channel for this texture set, which is pretty cool. And it's going to show up as an option, a slider if you will, down here at the bottom. And just make sure that you got it turned on. Mine's turned off at the moment, so it doesn't show up as a slider. Let me go back, turn it back on. And if I was to reduce the slider, you can see that I can change the effect, which is pretty cool. I like that. So now it is halfway transparent. This is not exactly the illusion that I'm going for, but case in point, we can change the opacity of our objects once we enable the correct shader and add that channel into our properties, our texture properties. So let's continue the illusion here. I think I'm going to work with the height value first, and I like this anisotropic texture. It's pretty rad. I'm digging it. It's a little too much at the moment. I don't want to see all these very sharp waves coming from this procedural texture. I like the little ripples that it's creating here, but I think I want to blur them out. Let's add the filter real fast. Let's blur it out. And I'm going to, oops, I didn't want bevel, excuse me. I wanted blur. Butterfingers. There we go, blur. We'll go into the parameters of our blur, and I'm going to blur it pretty significantly. Yeah, that's pretty cool. Somewhere right around there. Just the illusion of soft little waves coming from the pond itself. Some of these hard edges are coming from the lack of a shading group on the water object. That will get solved over in Blender, so I'm not too worried about that. We can resolve these small little surface shading objects or surface shading issues back in Blender without having it be any effect on the object itself. Now, I'm using a procedural texture, and I'm getting a really odd seam running down the back. I don't know how easy it is for you guys to see that at home, but if we go back to the image and go all the way to the top of the texture properties, let's experiment around with this projection type. If we use UV projection type, yeah, it's still getting that really ugly seam. We also have planar projection. Let's see. I don't think the planar projection type is giving me the information that I'm after. If we change it to triplanar, yeah, it's still there, and I'll have to revisit my UVs. This just may be the result of a seam in the UVs, and I think it is. I may go back over into Blender and fix that real fast, but that's either here nor there. I'm liking the result that I'm getting so far. So let's kind of finish out the result here a little bit. I'm also going to use this exact same anastrophic procedural image for my base color. Now, the cool thing about working with these procedural images is that if you were to make a change to all the projection properties, like the size and the projection map, it's going to continue to use that all the way across the entire system, which is pretty neat. It happens at the fill layer level versus the actual channel level, which is pretty neat. Now, for the base color, I think I'm going to use a gradient, and I'm starting to see that maybe, yeah, let's do it real fast. Let's add the generated effect. And it's not a generator. I always get that wrong in my imagination. It's a filter. And now let's do the gradient. And I'm thinking we only need 2, but we'll go with 3. The white is going to be a blue. The gray, let's have the gray, because the gray looks like it's all the troughs. You know, the white looks like the peaks, so the gray is going to be the trough, so we'll make it a much darker blue. Yeah, and of course the black areas are a highlight, so I'll make that a much lighter white. A light blue, excuse me. Yeah, let's just go with that for the time being. And of course, the roughness for this entire object is going to be pegged to 1. We want it to, water should be reflective. There we go. Maybe we put a little bit of some spots in the roughness just to kind of break it up a little bit. Not digging it, but maybe a simple change in the balance will get us back to where we are. Yeah, that's not so bad. I got some work in here that I need to do, but we're getting there. Now, the last thing I want to do is that I want to use this anastrophic radial material that I've been using for the height and the color to do my opacity as well. Because I want it to be opaque in some areas and then translucent in others. This gives me a great control. Let's see, if I invert it, is that what I'm after? Yeah, I'm also going to change the balance here a little bit. It's a little too transparent. I just want it to be slightly transparent. Yeah, that's cool. That's starting to look pretty good. It's slightly transparent. As you get down to the side, you can actually see through the water. I may have gone a little too far with it, but that's the cool thing about working inside of Substance Painter, is that we can play around with some of these values and really explore how it's working. I think I may be going the wrong direction on the balance. Yeah, I went the wrong direction. Sometimes small little changes to these sliders have big impacts. Yeah, that's it. Because what I want to be able to see is I want to be able to see down through the water to the log underneath. That's going to create some cool refraction when we render this, and I'm starting to really dig it. So changing your shader type to the opacity or the alpha with blending is going to allow you to create transparent effects inside of Substance Painter. When we start applying images to our opacity channels and our height channels, we can very quickly create some realistic water effects right here inside of Substance Painter.